The year was 1912, a time when life moved more slowly, when every event in a town carried with it an air of significance. In Norwich, a modest but proud English town, the marriage of Eleanor Whitmore and Charles Ratcliffe was not just a family celebration, it was a communal one. Weddings in those days were not simply private affairs. They were markers of unity, of hope, and of stability, especially in a society still recovering from the uncertainties of the previous century. That spring morning carried with it a sense of quiet promise. The air was fresh, the gardens of the Whitmore family home blooming with roses and primroses. The Whitmores were not aristocrats, but they were respected merchants who had built a reputation for honesty and warmth. Eleanor, the bride, was known in her town for her gentleness, her habit of reading to children at the church on Sundays, and her graceful manner that seemed to put everyone at ease. Charles, the groom, was the son of a schoolmaster, admired for his determination and for the way he treated everyone with fairness, whether they were fellow merchants, farmers, or the laborers who worked in the fields. The guests arrived in carriages, dressed in their finest clothes. Women wore gowns of white lace or pastel tones, with wide hats adorned with feathers. Men in waistcoats and stiff collars exchanged polite greetings, their polished shoes crunching on the gravel paths of the estate. A string quartet was arranged under a pavilion near the garden, their instruments glistening in the sun. There was laughter, chatter, and the unmistakable hum of joy that comes when two souls are about to be joined in what everyone hopes will be a lifelong bond. When Eleanor appeared, she stole the breath of those gathered. Her gown, sewn by her mother and a local seamstress, was not extravagantly expensive, but carried a kind of purity that could not be purchased. The lace veil draped delicately over her shoulders. The bouquet of lilies and wildflowers trembled slightly in her hands as she walked down the path, her father by her side. Charles, standing at the end of the garden aisle, felt his own hands grow cold, though his heart burned with certainty. It was the certainty of a man who knew he was not merely marrying a woman, but gaining a partner, a confidant, someone who would share every triumph and endure every hardship with him. The vows, spoken under the shade of a great oak tree, echoed with sincerity. There was no grand cathedral for this union, no vast wealth displayed. Instead, it was the simplicity that made it memorable. The sun lit their faces as they promised to honor and cherish one another, their voices steady even as emotions threatened to break through. The minister spoke of love as both a gift and a responsibility, something to be nurtured, tended to, much like the very garden in which they stood. And when Eleanor and Charles sealed their vows with a kiss, the applause from the gathered guests was not just a formality. It was genuine, full of hope, as though everyone was investing their own dreams of stability and joy into this young couple. After the ceremony, the celebrations began. Tables were set with bread, cheese, meats, and homemade pies. Children ran across the lawn, their laughter mixing with the music of the quartet. Toasts were made, with Charles's father offering words of wisdom about patience in marriage, and Eleanor's mother reminding her daughter that love must always be stronger than pride. It was the kind of advice that could seem simple in the moment, but would later, through years of living, reveal its profound truth. Then came the moment of the photograph. At the turn of the 20th century, photography was still regarded as something precious. Families did not pose for cameras every day as we do now. To stand for a photograph was to record a legacy, to freeze a moment that would outlive its participants. The guests gathered in front of the house, arranging themselves carefully. The bride and groom in the center, the parents on either side, siblings and friends filling in the edges. Everyone wanted to appear their best, to be captured for history. As they stood there, the photographer adjusted his equipment, a large boxy camera mounted on a sturdy tripod. He lifted the black cloth, peered into the lens, and called for everyone to hold still. The smiles were not forced, they reflected the genuine happiness of the day. In that moment, Eleanor and Charles stood as though nothing could ever disturb their joy, and truly, to all who witnessed, it seemed the beginning of a life that would be defined by love, resilience, and family. What no one noticed, at least not then, was the tall glass window behind them. The sunlight reflected faintly off its panes, revealing shapes inside the house. No one paid attention to it, for all eyes were focused on the couple before them. The shutter clicked, the flash flared, and the image was secured. The day continued with dancing, singing, and endless conversation, while the photograph was tucked away to be developed later. To those who lived that day, the wedding seemed perfect, untouched by shadows, unmarred by sorrow. It was, in every visible way, a celebration of love in its purest form. But as history would later reveal, sometimes even in the brightest of moments, hidden stories linger just beyond the frame, waiting to make themselves known. And so, the wedding of Eleanor and Charles in 1912 stood not just as the beginning of their journey together, but as the backdrop for a mystery that would echo through generations. When the wedding celebrations ended and the final guests had departed, Eleanor and Charles felt the warm glow of a day well lived. Their hands were still entwined when the last carriage rolled away into the night. To them, the day had been perfect. The laughter, the vows, the music in the garden, everything felt like a promise of happiness yet to come. The photograph, however, had yet to be seen. In 1912, pictures were not instant. The heavy camera, with its glass plates and chemical processes, required skill and time before the image could be revealed. Several days later, the photographer returned. He carried a bundle of carefully developed prints, each protected in stiff envelopes. The Whitmore family gathered in the sitting room, eager to relive the joy of the wedding day through this new marvel of technology. Eleanor's mother passed the first photograph to Charles, who smiled broadly at the sight of himself standing tall beside his bride. The family leaned in closer, admiring the clarity of the picture, pointing out small details, the lace of Eleanor's veil, the playful grin of one of the younger cousins, the neat rows of guests. But as their eyes wandered to the background, silence slowly fell. Behind the smiling group, through the tall glass window of the Whitmore home, there appeared a figure. At first glance, it could have been dismissed as a trick of reflection, perhaps a dark shadow of the photographer himself. But the longer one stared, the clearer it became. The outline was human, unmistakably so. The figure was of a woman, standing unnaturally still, as though she were watching the proceedings from within the house. Her dress seemed old-fashioned even for 1912. Her hair pulled back tightly, her expression impossible to define yet strangely heavy. Her hands appeared clasped together, pressed just below her chest, and her face, though faint, looked pale against the darkness behind her. It was as though she had been there present, but unnoticed by anyone at the time. A hush fell over the room as the family exchanged uneasy glances. Eleanor's younger brother, only 12 years old, whispered, "Who is that?" His mother quickly told him not to speak so loudly. Charles, ever the rational man, leaned closer, squinting at the figure. "Perhaps it is a reflection," he suggested. "The light through glass can play tricks." But even as he said the words, he did not sound convinced. The photographer, who had taken dozens of portraits in his career, shook his head slowly. "Reflections tend to distort," he explained. "They do not create shapes so distinct. Whoever this is, she was there behind the glass when I opened the shutter." His calm but firm explanation only deepened the unease in the room. Eleanor, staring at the photo, felt her chest tighten. She had walked through that house repeatedly on her wedding day, entering the parlor to adjust her dress, moving through the hallways with her bridesmaids. At no point had she noticed anyone standing in the window, silently watching. She remembered asking the housemaid to close the shutters to keep the glare away. No servant would have dared linger there during the photograph. Then who had it been? For the next several days, the photograph became the subject of constant discussion. Relatives visiting to offer congratulations were shown the picture, their reactions always the same. A smile at the joyous couple, followed by a startled silence as their eyes drifted toward the ghostly woman in the window. Some insisted it must be a family friend who had slipped inside unnoticed. Others, more superstitious, whispered that it could not be of this world. In a time when spiritualism and seances were popular, many were quick to call it a ghost. They recalled the stories of mediums who claimed cameras could capture what the eye could not see. If spirits lingered among the living, Perhaps the photograph had revealed one. Though such ideas were met with skepticism by Charles, the notion began to settle in the corners of people's minds. After all, who else could the figure be? Eleanor's aunt, a stern woman with a sharp voice, finally broke the uncomfortable silence one evening. "It may not be a spirit," she said slowly. "It may be someone closer to us than you realize." Her words hung in the air, cryptic and unsettling. Eleanor pressed her for answers, but the older woman would say no more, only insisting that the photograph should be put away, hidden from view. But the image could not be unseen. Even when placed in a drawer, the memory of the figure lingered in Eleanor's mind. Each time she replayed the day in her head, she wondered, had she overlooked something? Was there, perhaps, someone inside that house who had been silently present while everyone else celebrated outside? Charles tried to reassure her, even if it was someone. He reasoned, they wished you no harm. They did nothing, they only watched. Let us not spoil our happiness by clinging to shadows. His words were kind, but Eleanor sensed that even he had begun to dream of the pale figure. Standing silently at the window, always watching, the mystery grew heavier, not because of the photograph itself, but because of the silence it stirred within the family. No one could offer a clear explanation, yet no one could bring themselves to ignore it either. The more they tried to dismiss the image, the more it felt like an unspoken truth pressing against the edges of their lives. What was certain was this: the wedding portrait, meant to capture pure joy, now carried something else, a reminder that even in moments of happiness, there can be presences unacknowledged, stories untold, and lives hidden behind glass. And for Eleanor, the shadow in the window would become the first of many questions about the family she thought she knew. The unease surrounding the wedding photograph grew heavier with each passing day. Visitors continued to comment on the figure in the glass, their hushed tones reminding Eleanor of a secret that refused to remain buried. Eventually, it was Eleanor's aunt, the same sharp, tongued woman who had first hinted at an explanation, who broke the silence completely. They were sitting in the drawing room when she leaned forward, her voice low but firm. "That figure," she said, pointing at the photograph lying on the table, "was not a stranger. It was your sister." The words struck Eleanor like a sudden blow. She blinked in confusion, her hand tightening around the arm of her chair. My sister," she stammered. "I have no sister." Her aunt sighed heavily. "You do, my dear, or rather you did. Her name was Margaret." The room seemed to grow colder. Eleanor's mother, sitting quietly in the corner, closed her eyes, her shoulders trembling. Her father shifted uncomfortably, as though the very mention of the name had stirred a long-buried guilt. Charles, seated beside his bride, looked at her with concern, unsure of whether to believe what he had just heard. The truth began to unfold slowly, painfully, as if the family had been waiting for years for someone brave enough to speak it aloud. Eleanor learned that Margaret Whitmore had been born nearly 6 years before her. A bright child, lively and intelligent, she had once been the pride of the household. But at the age of 11, Margaret fell ill with a severe fever that swept through the region. The sickness left her physically weakened and mentally altered. Her once quick tongue became hesitant, her energy replaced by frailty. She struggled to walk without assistance and often drifted into long silences, staring out windows as though she belonged to another world. In a society that valued appearances and strength, Margaret became an uncomfortable presence. Families like the Whitmores lived under the gaze of their neighbors, and illness, especially one that altered the mind, carried a stigma. People whispered of curses, of poor bloodlines, of divine punishment. For the Whitmores, proud of their social standing, the shame was unbearable, and so Margaret was quietly withdrawn from public life. She was kept indoors, her name seldom spoken outside the family. Visitors to the home were told she was resting upstairs or away with relatives. Servants were instructed to remain silent about her. The Whitmores cared for her needs, but they did so in secrecy, as though her very existence were something to be hidden. By the time Eleanor was born, Margaret had already become a shadow in the household. Eleanor, a child full of questions, had once overheard faint laughter from a locked room, but was told it was the wind. As she grew, she accepted her parents' silence and never pressed further. The truth had been deliberately withheld from her, as though erasing Margaret would protect the family's reputation and allow Eleanor to live unburdened. But Margaret had lived and suffered all the same. She spent most of her life in a small upstairs room, surrounded by books she could no longer read and a window that became her only connection to the outside world. She would sit for hours, gazing out at the garden, watching the seasons change, watching neighbors pass by who never knew her name. When the fever finally claimed her entirely just weeks before Eleanor's wedding, her death was marked not with a public funeral, but with a quiet burial at the edge of the town cemetery. Few outside the immediate family even knew she had existed. And yet, the photograph had changed everything. There she was, or at least her likeness, standing in the window on Eleanor's happiest day, refusing to be erased. Eleanor sat in silence as her aunt spoke. A storm of emotions raged within her: grief for a sister she had never known, anger at her parents for their silence, guilt that she had celebrated her wedding without thought of the sibling who had died so recently. Charles placed his hand on hers, steadying her, but she could feel his unease as well. Her mother finally spoke, her voice trembling. "We did not wish you to grow up under that shadow. We wanted you to have a normal life, free from pity and whispers. Margaret was not meant for this world." But Eleanor's heart rebelled at those words. "She was meant for this world," she replied softly, tears gathering in her eyes. "She lived in it, even if you chose not to see her. She was my sister." From that moment, Eleanor made a quiet vow Margaret would not be forgotten. Though the family may have hidden her in life, Eleanor would carry her memory forward. She began asking for details: what books Margaret had loved, what songs she had hummed, what little habits had made her smile. Slowly, through fragments and reluctant admissions, Eleanor pieced together the image of a sister both real and human, not just a ghostly figure trapped behind glass. The wedding photograph, once a source of fear, became something different for Eleanor. She no longer saw the figure in the window as a haunting but as a reminder. It was as though Margaret had insisted on being present, on witnessing the joy she had been denied, on ensuring her younger sister would not live in ignorance of her existence. Eleanor framed the photograph and kept it in her home, despite the discomfort it caused visitors. When asked about the shadowy figure, she no longer avoided the truth. She told them, "That was my sister Margaret. She was part of this family, though the world never knew her." And in doing so, Eleanor gave Margaret what she had been denied in life: recognition, dignity, and love. The forgotten sister was forgotten no longer. The photograph, once a source of unease, gradually became a symbol of something greater in Eleanor's life. Where others saw only a strange, ghostly figure in the window, Eleanor began to see a lesson: that even those whom society pushed into the shadows deserved to be remembered. At first, it wasn't easy. The Whitmore family still preferred silence. Her parents, embarrassed by the idea that their hidden daughter was now a subject of discussion, urged Eleanor to keep quiet. "Let the past remain where it belongs," her father would say. But Eleanor could not ignore the truth. The more she learned about Margaret, the more she felt her presence in everyday life. Eleanor began to ask questions of those who had known Margaret best: the servants who had delivered her meals, the childhood friends who had visited before the illness took hold, even her aunt, whose stern exterior often softened when speaking about the girl she had once known. Each story painted a picture: Margaret humming softly as she sewed, Margaret sketching flowers in the margins of her books, Margaret staring at the stars through her bedroom window, as though the heavens were whispering secrets only she could hear. What pained Eleanor most was not Margaret's illness itself, but the way her humanity had been concealed. She was not remembered for her laughter or her kindness, but for her absence. The girl who stayed upstairs, the sister never mentioned. That injustice stirred something powerful within Eleanor. She resolved to change it, not only for Margaret's sake, but for the sake of everyone who had ever been hidden, ignored, or forgotten. Years passed, and Eleanor carried her vow into her new life with Charles. She spoke openly of Margaret to her children, weaving her into the family's story as though she had always been present. "You had an aunt," she told them as they gathered by the fire. "Her name was Margaret. She loved the garden and the smell of rain on spring mornings." The children listened wide-eyed, as though their unseen aunt was sitting beside them, smiling softly. To Eleanor, remembrance became a form of love, a way of keeping Margaret alive in the hearts of those who had never met her. The wedding portrait hung prominently in their home, and whenever visitors asked about the faint figure in the window, Eleanor would explain the story without hesitation. Some found it unsettling, but most were moved. They began to see that the shadow in the glass was not a ghostly omen, but a reminder of the importance of dignity, even for those society would rather overlook. In time, Eleanor's way of speaking about Margaret influenced more than just her own family. Friends who visited began reflecting on their own relatives. The cousin who had died young, the grandmother who had been institutionalized, the neighbor who was left out of community gatherings because of illness or disability. These conversations carried weight. They reminded people that lives should not be measured only by their ease or visibility, but by the love they carried and the stories they left behind. Eleanor also began supporting those who were marginalized in her community. At the church, she volunteered with children who were sickly or considered different, ensuring they were included in lessons and celebrations. She quietly provided food and blankets to families who kept relatives hidden away, encouraging them not to feel shame. In her own quiet way, she became a voice of compassion in a time when judgment was easier than understanding. Charles, once skeptical of the figure in the glass, grew to admire Eleanor's conviction. He would often say, "It is because of Margaret that our family has learned true kindness." Together, they instilled in their children the belief that no one should be erased, no matter how brief or difficult their life. The lesson in remembrance grew stronger as Eleanor herself grew older. When her children had children of their own, she continued to share Margaret's story. "Do not let your lives become blind to those who suffer quietly," she would tell them. "Even the ones we cannot always see shape who we are." The great-grandchildren, curious about the photograph with the strange shadow, grew up knowing that they came from a family that valued memory over convenience, truth over silence. By the time Eleanor reached her final years, Margaret's name was no longer a hidden shame. It was spoken freely, carried across generations, remembered not for her isolation but for the compassion she inspired. The photograph, though faded with age, still held its strange power. Visitors continued to pause at the sight of the figure in the window, and the family continued to explain, "That is Margaret. She was part of us, and she always will be." In remembering her sister, Eleanor discovered a truth that applies far beyond her own family. We live in a world that often prizes strength, beauty, and success, while quietly pushing aside those who do not fit such molds. Yet true humanity is found not in how we celebrate the strong, but in how we honor the vulnerable. To remember someone, even someone hidden, someone different, someone imperfect, is to affirm their worth, to say, "You mattered." This was the lesson Eleanor carried from her wedding day, that joy is not diminished by including the forgotten, but enriched by it. Margaret's presence in the photograph was no accident. It was a call, a silent plea from the past, to ensure that love extends to all, even those who stand behind glass, unnoticed by the crowd. And so, in telling Margaret's story, Eleanor transformed what could have been a haunting into a blessing. She taught her family, her community, and even strangers who saw the portrait that remembrance is not merely about the past. It is about shaping the present with compassion and building a future where no one is left unseen. The shadow in the glass became, in the end, a light, a reminder that memory has the power to heal, to honor, and to make us truly human. Time has a way of softening memories, turning even the most difficult ones into stories passed between generations. Yet the wedding portrait of Eleanor and Charles never softened. It remained sharp, stubborn, and demanding. While most family photographs faded into sentimental decoration, this one held a question, a presence, a reminder. The picture itself was ordinary in many ways. The young bride in her lace gown, the proud groom beside her, family members flanking them with their best smiles. But no one could look at the photograph without eventually noticing the faint, almost translucent figure in the tall glass window behind them. The shadow of Margaret. At first, Eleanor kept the portrait in her private parlor. Some visitors found it unsettling and even whispered that it should be destroyed. "It casts a gloom on such a happy day," one neighbor remarked, shaking her head. But Eleanor refused. She believed the portrait was no curse. It was an anchor. It kept Margaret alive in memory, a permanent seat at the table she had been denied in life. To Eleanor, hiding the picture would have been a second burial. Over time, the photograph took on a new role in the Radcliffe household. It became a teaching tool. Eleanor's children, curious about the mysterious figure, would ask again and again, "Who is she?" And Eleanor would tell them. Each time she repeated Margaret's story, refusing to let it vanish into silence. By the time her children had grown, they spoke of their Aunt Margaret as though they had known her themselves. They described her gentleness, her love of starlight, her long illness, all second-hand knowledge, yet carried with such conviction that it became part of their own memory. In this way, the photograph's legacy stretched far beyond the day it was taken. It gave Margaret a place in family history that otherwise might have been erased. More importantly, it reshaped the family's values. Where once the Whitmores had chosen secrecy and silence, Eleanor's branch of the family chose openness. The story of the shadow in the glass became a cautionary tale, a reminder that shame has no place in love. As the decades passed, visitors continued to react strongly to the picture. Some recoiled, unsettled by what they saw. Others leaned closer, fascinated. A few skeptics insisted the figure must have been a smudge on the glass or an accidental reflection of one of the guests. But no matter how they tried to explain it away, no one left without remembering it. That was its quiet power. It refused to be dismissed. In the 1930s, when Eleanor's children had families of their own, the portrait still hung in the parlor. By then, photography had become more common, but none of their other pictures stirred such conversations. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers would remark on it, sometimes nervously, sometimes reverently. The younger generations grew up not frightened by the shadow, but inspired. They saw it as a symbol of resilience, proof that even when the world tries to hide someone, truth has a way of surfacing. During the difficult years of the Second World War, when loss and separation touched nearly every household, the story of Margaret took on fresh meaning. Eleanor's grandchildren, some of whom saw their fathers leave for the front, took comfort in the idea that even the unseen remained part of the family's story. "They are still with us," Eleanor would say, touching the faded photograph. "As long as we remember, no one is ever truly gone." After Eleanor's passing, the photograph was carefully passed down, first to her eldest daughter, then to her grandchildren. Each generation was entrusted not only with the physical picture, but with the responsibility of telling the story. Margaret's memory became less about tragedy and more about compassion. She was no longer the hidden sister, but the aunt who taught us kindness, though she never asked for it. By the late 20th century, the portrait had gained a kind of legend in the family. Some called it the wedding with two brides, Eleanor in her gown and Margaret watching quietly from the window. Others referred to it as the shadow of love, a phrase one great-grandchild coined when explaining the photograph at school. Teachers and classmates who heard the story were struck by its weight. What had once been a family's secret shame had turned into a legacy of empathy. The portrait even inspired changes in how the family treated others. Descendants of Eleanor and Charles became nurses, teachers, and caregivers, citing Margaret's story as their motivation. "Because she was forgotten, we must remember others," one great-granddaughter once said. The photograph had sown seeds of compassion that continued to grow across generations. Even outside the family, the picture held influence. Visitors who encountered it often carried the story home. A neighbor might recall it years later, when deciding to care for an elderly relative rather than hide them away. A school friend might repeat it as a ghost story, only for the moral, the importance of remembrance, to linger longer than the chills. The photograph's legacy was not in its mystery but in its message: no life is meaningless, no presence undeserving of love. What had once been considered an embarrassment had become a guiding principle. The shadow in the glass was no longer a source of fear. It was a reminder that compassion has the power to rewrite even the most painful histories. Today, more than a century later, the portrait still survives. Its edges are yellowed, its glass slightly cracked, but the image remains clear. The smiles of Eleanor and Charles shine brightly, as though untouched by time. And behind them, faint but undeniable, Margaret still stands, eternal in her silence, yet louder in her lesson than any words could ever beat. For those who inherit it, the photograph is more than an heirloom. It is a responsibility. To tell the story, to honor the forgotten, to ensure that no one, no sister, no brother, no child, is left behind a closed window. That is the true legacy of the photograph, a family transformed by remembrance, and a shadow turned into light. More than a century has passed since that wedding portrait was taken in 1912. The fashions of the day, the lace gowns, the feathered hats, the stiff collars, now feel like relics from another world. The Whitmore home where the picture was staged has long since been sold, its garden overgrown, its windows replaced. Even Eleanor and Charles, who once stood so proudly in the sunlight of their wedding day, are now names etched in stone. And yet, the photograph remains. Its power lies not in its age, nor even in the mystery of the faint figure in the window. Its true power is in the lesson it carries for us today, that remembrance is not just about the past, but about how we choose to live in the present. In our time, society is louder and faster than Eleanor could have ever imagined. We are surrounded by countless images every day, most of them fleeting. People capture moments with the tap of a finger, but those moments are often scrolled past, forgotten almost as soon as they appear. We have never had so many ways to remember, and yet, paradoxically, we forget more quickly than ever. The story of the wedding portrait challenges us to resist this forgetfulness. It reminds us that true remembrance is not about the number of photographs we take, but about the love and dignity we attach to them. When Eleanor chose to keep that unsettling picture on her wall, she was making a statement. Even the lives we try to hide deserve to be honored. How often do we, in our own lives, push people to the margins? Sometimes it is subtle. We avoid those who are ill because their suffering makes us uncomfortable, or we overlook the elderly because their pace does not match our hurried world. Other times it is systemic. Entire groups of people made invisible because they do not fit neatly into society's definition of strength or success. The story of Margaret is not just about one forgotten sister. It is about all the people who have ever been left behind a closed window. When we look at the photograph today, we see more than just a family mystery. We see a mirror held up to our own lives. Who are the Margarets around us? Who are the ones watching silently from behind glass, present but unseen, longing for acknowledgement? The message is clear: we must open our eyes and hearts to them. Remembrance is not merely about speaking names from the past. It is about recognizing dignity in the present. It is about including the quiet, the overlooked, the different in the circle of our care. Eleanor's choice to tell her children about Margaret rather than letting her memory fade changed the trajectory of her family. It made them more compassionate, more attentive, more human. That same choice is open to us today, every time we remember someone who has been overlooked. Whether it is a relative whose story has been buried, a neighbor struggling silently, or even a stranger whose pain is dismissed, we push back against the kind of silence that once erased Margaret. There is another lesson too. Perhaps the most profound of all: our legacy is not measured by our visibility but by our impact. Margaret lived a short, hidden life, yet her presence in a single photograph reshaped generations. She never delivered speeches, never achieved public honors, never stood at the center of a crowd. And yet, she became the heart of her family's moral compass. She reminded them, and now us, that no life is too small to matter. This truth carries an incredible weight in our modern world, where so many measure their worth in likes, followers, or fleeting recognition. The shadow in the glass teaches us that even those who are unseen can shape the future in ways unimaginable. the quiet acts of love, the unnoticed sacrifices, the silent endurance of hardship, these too are legacies. For us today, the message is simple but urgent: live in such a way that no one is forgotten. Speak the names of those who have gone before. Honor those who struggle quietly. Refuse to let society's obsession with perfection and image erase the real, messy, human stories that give life its depth. In schools, in families, in communities, let us keep alive the habit of remembrance. Tell the stories of the ones who came before us, not just the triumphant, but also the vulnerable. Share the lessons of those who were hidden, for it is often their struggles that teach us the most about compassion. When future generations look back at us, as we now look back at Eleanor and Charles, what will they see in our photographs? Will they see only smiles posed for appearances, or will they see the deeper truth of people who valued every life, who remembered even those whom the world wanted to erase? The Whitmore wedding portrait still whispers across time. Its strange shadow is no longer a source of fear but of light. It tells us that our joy is incomplete unless it includes the forgotten. It calls us to open our eyes, to see the unseen, to let no one fade into silence. And so, the message for us today is this: leave as though every life matters, because it does. Remember, not just with your mind, but with your actions. Carry forward the unseen, and in doing so, you will transform shadows into legacies.